somewhere in a mountain valley you've never heard of, in a country most people couldn't point to on a map. A plague broke out in the year 1338. Nobody in Europe noticed. Nobody in China wrote it down. And yet that single, forgotten outbreak would go on to kill more human beings than any other event in recorded history. For almost 700 years, we told ourselves the wrong story about where it started. We blamed the wrong animal for spreading it. We built an entire myth around a siege that probably had almost nothing to do with it. And the real trigger, the thing that finally pushed a smoldering regional outbreak into a continent-devouring catastrophe, wasn't a rat, wasn't a soldier, and wasn't even a decision made by a human being at all. It was a volcano nobody has ever identified on the other side of the planet, that nobody in medieval Europe ever knew existed. This is the real story of the Black Death, pieced together not from old chronicles, but from tree rings, ice cores, and DNA pulled out of 700-year-old teeth. And almost everything you were taught about it is either incomplete or flatly wrong. Let's start by being honest about what we're actually discussing, because the phrase Black Death has been softened by centuries of retelling until it sounds almost quaint, like a bad chapter in a history textbook, rather than the single deadliest event human beings have ever lived through. Between 1346 and 1353, in a span of roughly 7 years, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died. Historians who have spent entire careers trying to pin down a more precise figure generally land somewhere around 50 million deaths in Europe alone, out of a pre-plague population of about 80 million. That means well over half of the continent's population was gone in less than a decade. Not gone as in moved away, gone as in dead. To put that number into perspective, it dwarfs the combined military and civilian death toll of the Second World War. It is larger than the total number of people killed under every 20th century authoritarian regime combined. In Venice, roughly 7 out of every 10 residents died. In the German port cities of Hamburg and Bremen, the toll climbed even higher. In Cairo, entire neighborhoods were simply abandoned, left as empty shells for more than 100 years afterward. In one Egyptian province, tax records show the number of registered landowners dropping from around 6,000 before the plague to little more than 100 afterward. An entire regional economy gutted in a single generation. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. For over 600 years, nobody actually knew where this thing came from. Not really. We had a story. We did not have evidence. And that story, the one that ended up in almost every textbook you were ever handed, turns out to be built on a foundation that modern science has spent the last few years quietly tearing apart. Starting with the most basic question of all, where did it actually begin? The traditional explanation, the one that has been repeated in classrooms for generations, goes something like this. Plague emerged somewhere deep in the interior of Asia, possibly on the Tibetan Plateau, possibly in the grasslands of Mongolia. From there, it supposedly rode the trade networks of the Mongol Empire westward, jumping from rodent to rodent, region to region, until it finally reached the shores of the Black Sea. This idea isn't new. Medieval chroniclers in both Europe and the Islamic world already suspected the plague had come from the east. The modern academic version of that theory can be traced to a French Orientalist named Joseph de Guignes, who published a sweeping history of Central Asia in 1756 and effectively cemented China as the plague's birthplace in the Western imagination. From there, it calcified into fact simply through repetition. Generation after generation of scholars cited the same assumption without anyone going back to check whether the underlying evidence actually held up. And when researchers finally did check, they found the case for China was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Yes, medieval Chinese records describe devastating epidemics and catastrophic population decline during the 14th century, with China's population falling from roughly 123 million to around 65 million between 1200 and 1393. But China during that same window was also being torn apart by decades of brutal warfare, the violent collapse of Mongol rule, and a chaotic transition into the Ming dynasty. Separating plague deaths from war deaths, famine deaths, and general societal collapse turned out to be nearly impossible using the sources available. There was no confirmed grave, no verified pathogen, no smoking gun, just a very old assumption that nobody had seriously tested. Meanwhile, sitting almost entirely ignored in a museum basement in St. Petersburg was the actual answer. High in the Tian Shan Mountains, in what is now northern Kyrgyzstan, there are 2 small medieval cemeteries known as Karajigash and Barana. These sites sit in the Chui Valley, a crossroads along the Silk Road where merchants from China, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean world once passed through on their way to somewhere else. Russian archaeologists excavated both cemeteries back in the 1880s and 1890s, and the human remains were shipped off to a museum in St. Petersburg, where they sat largely untouched for well over 100 years. But somebody, at some point, had actually read the tombstones. And the tombstones were strange. An unusually large cluster of them were dated to exactly 2 years, 1338 and 1339. 10 of those stones explicitly recorded the cause of death using a word that translates to pestilence. A sudden spike in mortality, concentrated in a tiny 2-year window in a small trading community, is not what ordinary disease looks like. It's what an outbreak looks like. For decades, a handful of historians pointed at this anomaly and were largely ignored. Some argued the deaths could have come from any number of unrelated diseases. Others noted that Karadzic was far too small and remote a settlement to have launched a pandemic that would eventually kill a third of the known world. So the tombstone sat there, a strange footnote nobody wanted to build a theory on. That changed in 2022, when a team led by archaeogeneticist Maria Spyrou at the University of Tübingen, working alongside historian Philip Slavin, published a landmark study in the journal Nature. They extracted ancient DNA directly from the teeth of individuals buried at Kara-Jigach, people whose tombstones explicitly named pestilence as their cause of death. And what they found in that DNA was unmistakable. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. But identifying the bacterium wasn't even the biggest part of the discovery. What the researchers found buried inside that ancient genome was something that would rewrite the entire evolutionary family tree of the disease. And it's the part almost nobody outside of a handful of academic journals has ever heard about. Scientists had already known for years that the Black Death was tied to what geneticists call a Big Bang event, a moment when Yersinia pestis suddenly diversified into 4 separate major lineages, branches of the bacterium that are still circulating in rodent populations across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas today. What nobody had ever found was the ancestor strain, the single root at the base of that evolutionary tree from which every one of those deadly branches eventually grew. The Kyrgyzstan strain was it. Genomically, it sat precisely at the base of that tree, the direct common ancestor of every plague lineage that would later devastate Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Researchers now had not just a location, but a date, 1338, a full 8 years before plague ever reached the shores of Europe. And when the team looked at where the closest living relatives of this ancient strain exist today, they found them in marmots, living in the mountains surrounding those very cemeteries, strongly suggesting the bacterium had evolved locally and jumped from burrowing rodents into a small community of Silk Road traders. Not China, not Mongolia, not the Tibetan Plateau, a handful of merchant families in a mountain valley in Central Asia. But finding where the fire started doesn't explain how it burned down half the known world. For that, the traditional story turns to one of the most famous, most cinematic scenes in medieval history, a siege, a catapult, and a pile of infected corpses. In 1346, forces of the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state controlling the steppe north of the Black Sea, laid siege to Kaffa, a heavily fortified Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula. According to a second-hand account written by an Italian notary named Gabriele de Musi, when plague broke out among the besieging army, the Mongols allegedly catapulted their own infected dead over the city walls, deliberately infecting the defenders inside. Terrified, Genoese merchants supposedly fled by ship to Sicily, carrying the plague with them, and from that single port the pestilence consumed the entire Mediterranean world. It is, without question, a great story. Corpses arcing over castle walls, biological warfare centuries before the term existed. It has been repeated in book after book, documentary after documentary, as the definitive origin point of the European pandemic. There's just one problem. The evidence behind it barely holds together. De Musi was not present at the siege. His account was written after the fact, likely compiled from rumor and second-hand testimony, and historians have argued for decades over how much of it is reliable reporting versus dramatic embellishment. There's also a scientific problem. Yersinia pestis spreads primarily through flea bites, not through casual contact with a decomposing corpse thrown over a wall. A dead body might carry infected fleas for a short window, but the bacterium itself doesn't survive long once its host stops producing body heat and blood flow. As a psychological weapon, hurling plague corpses into a besieged city would have been horrifying. As an actual transmission mechanism, it was almost certainly far less effective than the legend suggests. More importantly, plague was already circulating through the wider Black Sea region before the siege of Kaffa ever began. Trade caravans were moving, fleas were migrating through rodent populations across the steppe. The pathogen didn't need a single dramatic catapult assault to reach Europe. It was already working its way toward the coast through dozens of quieter, less cinematic channels. As one modern epidemiological study concluded, the Kaffa incident may well explain how plague entered that one specific city, but it almost certainly does not explain how plague entered Europe as a whole. Kaffa wasn't the ignition point. It was one small, dramatic scene inside a much larger, messier story. So if it wasn't the catapults, and if it wasn't a single dramatic siege, what actually pulled the trigger? The answer, it turns out, Involved something nobody in 14th century Europe could have possibly seen coming, buried not in a chronicle or a battlefield, but frozen inside the growth rings of centuries-old trees. Researchers analyzing tree ring data from ancient trees in the Spanish Pyrenees noticed something strange about 3 consecutive years: 1345, 1346, and 1347. These were the coldest 3 summers recorded across the northern hemisphere's extratropical zone in nearly a century, cold enough to produce a rare phenomenon called blue rings, a visible deformity in wood caused by cells that fail to fully form their walls because the growing season was interrupted by freezing temperatures. That kind of sudden, sustained cold snap doesn't happen from ordinary weather variation. It requires a massive injection of sulfur and ash into the upper atmosphere, the signature of a major volcanic eruption. Cross-referencing the tree ring anomaly against ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, researchers identified evidence of a previously unknown eruption, or possibly a cluster of eruptions occurring around 1345. Their estimate, roughly 14 teragrams of sulfur injected into the stratosphere. For comparison, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, one of the largest volcanic events of the modern era, released around 6 teragrams. Whatever erupted in the mid-1340s released more than double that. The resulting haze would have blocked sunlight across the Mediterranean for multiple consecutive growing seasons, and the historical record backs this up. Contemporary accounts from Spain, southern France, northern Italy, Egypt, and the Levant describe unusual persistent cloud cover, unnaturally dark lunar eclipses, and widespread crop failures. Grain harvests collapsed, famine loomed, and in cities like Venice and Genoa, whose entire economic power rested on maritime trade rather than domestic agriculture, hungry populations pushed their ruling merchant classes toward a crisis point. So the merchants of Venice and Genoa did what merchants always do in a crisis. They went looking for grain, and the most reliable grain supply within reach sat on the shores of the Black Sea, controlled by the Golden Horde. In 1347, Venetian and Genoese traders negotiated an emergency ceasefire with their Mongol rivals and secured grain shipments from ports around the Sea of Azov. That grain almost certainly saved lives in Italy. It also, unknowingly, carried something else on board every single ship: rat fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, feeding on grain dust and surviving the entire voyage across the Black Sea and into the heart of the Mediterranean. This single detail also explains one of the great unanswered puzzles of the plague: why some Italian cities were devastated while others nearby were barely touched. Rome and Milan, both large inland cities, surrounded by their own fertile farmland, had little need to import emergency grain and suffered comparatively lower mortality. Venice and Genoa, dependent on the sea for their food supply, sent the ships, received the grain, and became the plague's first and deadliest entry points into Western Europe. A volcano nobody saw erupting somewhere on the other side of the world had, through a chain of climate disruption, economic desperation, and maritime trade, delivered a bacterium from a Central Asian mountain valley directly into the harbors of Italy. And that wasn't even the last assumption this story got wrong, because the single most iconic image associated with the Black Death, the image printed on the cover of nearly every book ever written about it, may never have actually been the thing driving the disease through Europe's cities at all. For well over a century, the standard explanation for how plague spread through European towns has centered on one animal: the black rat, Rattus rattus. The story is simple and intuitive. Rats carry infected fleas. Rats die. Their fleas, now homeless, jump onto the nearest available human and start the cycle of infection all over again. It's a tidy explanation, and it's the reason rats became visually synonymous with the plague in the popular imagination. But in 2018, a team led by Catherine Dean at the University of Oslo published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that put this assumption to a direct mathematical test. Using detailed mortality records from multiple plague outbreaks across Europe spanning the 14th through 19th centuries, the researchers modeled 3 separate transmission scenarios: rat-borne fleas, airborne person-to-person spread, and transmission via human ectoparasites, meaning the fleas and body lice that live directly on people rather than on rodents. The results were striking. In 7 out of 9 regional outbreaks studied, the human ectoparasite model matched the real historical mortality data far more closely than either the rat model or the airborne model. In other words, the plague appears to have spread predominantly through the fleas and lice already living on human bodies, and in human clothing and bedding, not through infested rats scurrying through the streets. This finding actually resolves several long-standing puzzles historians have wrestled with for decades. Rats have small territorial ranges and don't move quickly through a population, yet the plague spread through medieval cities at a speed that never quite fit the rat-driven model. Archaeologists studying plague-era burial sites in London have also pointed out that if rat die-offs were truly driving the pandemic, we should be finding large deposits of dead rats in the archaeological record from that period. We aren't. What we do know is That in an era with no regular bathing, no regular laundering of clothing, and no concept of modern hygiene, human fleas and body lice were essentially universal, living in nearly every garment, every shared bed, every household across the continent. If those parasites were the primary carriers, the terrifying speed of the Black Death's spread suddenly makes far more sense. To be clear, this remains an area of active research, and rats almost certainly played some role, particularly in the plague's original jump from wild rodents into human trade networks. But the idea that infested rats were the primary engine driving mass transmission through European cities now looks like an oversimplification that stuck around far longer than the evidence actually supported. There's another piece of this story that gets left out of almost every Western retelling entirely. The plague's devastating and far longer lasting impact on the Islamic world. The Black Death reached Egypt and Syria in 1347, carried by the same Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean trade routes that delivered it to Italy. From there, it tore through the Mamluk Sultanate and across North Africa. Studies drawing on medieval Arabic sources estimate the plague killed roughly 42% of the population in Middle Eastern regions where sufficient records survive. In Cairo alone, an estimated 200,000 people, close to a third of the city's population, died. The great historian Ibn Khaldun, who lost both of his parents to the outbreak, wrote that it felt as though existence itself had called out for its own extinction. What makes this history particularly striking is that the Black Death was not a single event for the Islamic world the way it's often framed for Europe. It was merely the first of more than 150 recorded plague outbreaks that struck the region across the following 5 centuries, a wave of recurring epidemics that continued well into the late 1800s, far longer than the disease's active period in Western Europe. And yet this entire 500-year chapter has received a fraction of the scholarly attention devoted to the European experience, distorting how the pandemic gets remembered on a global scale and obscuring how differently societies responded. In Europe, the plague fueled waves of anti-Semitic violence and self-flagellation movements. In much of the Islamic world, theological guidance framed the plague as a form of martyrdom and discouraged fleeing plague, stricken areas altogether, a stance that may have inadvertently increased local mortality even as it shaped a fundamentally different cultural response to catastrophe. And there's one final irony buried inside this entire story, one that connects every piece of it together. The very empire most often blamed for spreading the Black Death may have actually been its single greatest victim. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, had accomplished something unprecedented. A single interconnected economic and political zone stretching from Korea to Hungary, an era of relative safety and open trade historians now call the Pax Mongolica. Way stations placed along the Silk Road offered merchants fresh horses, food, and shelter, allowing goods, ideas, and information to move across Eurasia faster and more safely than at any previous point in history. But the same infrastructure that carried silk, spices, and diplomatic correspondence also carried disease. The Pax Mongolica didn't just enable unprecedented commerce, it enabled unprecedented contagion, and the Mongol Empire became one of the plague's greatest casualties. The disease tore through Mongol populations, killed rulers and military leadership, and disrupted the administrative systems holding the empire's vast territory together. Trade routes that had once been the empire's greatest achievement collapsed as travel became too dangerous. Political fragmentation followed. The Golden Horde splintered. The Yuan dynasty in China fell. An empire that had united half the known world was ultimately undone, in no small part, by a bacterium quietly circulating among the rodents of its own Central Asian heartland. The Mongols built the road killed them. So let's put it all together, because the accumulated weight of these individual corrections adds up to something much bigger than any single fact. They got the origin wrong. For centuries, textbooks pointed to China as the plague's birthplace, an assumption built largely on circumstantial evidence and repetition. Ancient DNA extracted from tombstones in Kyrgyzstan has now placed the true ancestral strain in the Tian Shan Mountains around 1338, a discovery no chronicle ever recorded and no historian predicted. They got the transmission wrong. The image of infested rats driving the plague through city streets has dominated the popular imagination for well over a century. Mathematical modeling of real mortality data suggests the disease more likely spread primarily through fleas and lice living directly on human bodies. They got the trigger wrong. The arrival of plague in Europe wasn't simply a matter of ships sailing west from the Black Sea on their own schedule. A previously unidentified volcanic eruption around 1345 triggered years of catastrophic cooling and crop failure, forcing Italian city-states into an emergency grain trade that unknowingly imported the disease along with the food. They got the Kaffa story wrong, or at least dramatically oversimplified it. The famous account of plague corpses catapulted over a city's walls. It makes for unforgettable storytelling. But the pathogen was already spreading through the Black Sea region independent of that single siege. And they got the scope wrong. By treating the Black Death primarily as a European tragedy, Historians spent centuries overlooking its equally catastrophic and far longer lasting impact on the Islamic world, where outbreaks recurred for 500 years after Europe's plague years had ended. What emerges from all of this isn't a simpler story than the one we were taught. It's a messier one, and a far more honest one. The Black Death wasn't a single event with a single cause and a single point of origin. It was a cascade. A volcano nobody witnessed darkened the skies over the Mediterranean. Famine forced desperate merchants to sail east for grain, and a bacterium that had spent centuries quietly evolving among the marmots of a remote mountain valley suddenly found new hosts, riding not in the fur of rats, but in the fleas and lice living on human bodies themselves. There's something uncomfortable in that pattern, something that doesn't stay neatly locked inside the 14th century. The same trade networks that made the Mongol Empire and the Italian city-states powerful were the exact same networks that turned a regional outbreak into a civilization-altering catastrophe. Interconnected supply chains, global trade, and dense urban populations weren't the accident that let the Black Death happen. They were the precondition for it. A globalized, climate-disrupted world with animal diseases regularly crossing into human populations isn't a 14th century problem. It's a description of the world we live in right now. For over 600 years, we told ourselves a clean, simple story about rats on ships in a single dramatic siege. It took ancient DNA, tree ring analysis, ice core samples, and modern epidemiological modeling to finally get closer to the truth. And the truth turns out to be less a story about where a disease came from and more a warning about what happens when environmental disruption, economic desperation, and microbial evolution collide inside a deeply connected world. That warning isn't just historical, it's current. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, drop a skull emoji in the comments. I genuinely want to see how many of you stuck around for the whole story. And if you're not subscribed yet, it really does help the channel more than you'd think. If you enjoyed this deep dive, I've got another one linked right here that I think you're going to love just as much. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.